My name is Nadia Osei. I'm 33 years old. And the Sunday I found my house listed for sale on a real estate app was the day I finally understood that some people will erase you from your own life if you let them do it quietly enough, and that the quietest, most effective answer to that erasure is a document, maintained, in a place you know exactly how to find. I found the listing at 7:14 in the morning. I was standing in the kitchen in work clothes. I had an early site visit, a routine structural inspection on a commercial build 40 minutes north, and I was scrolling through my phone while my coffee finished. I had a habit of checking the local real estate listings. Professional habit, mostly. I tracked what the coastal market was doing because it told me things about where development money was moving, which sector construction was following, which neighborhoods were attracting the kind of capital that eventually turns into permit applications that eventually land on my desk. I had been doing this for years, the same way I do most things, systematically, without making a production of it. The thumbnail stopped me before the address loaded. Cedar siding. The particular angle of the covered porch. The Japanese maple in the front yard that I had planted the first spring I owned the place, when it was barely taller than my knee and I had staked it against the wind off the water because the nursery woman told me the coast wind would knock it over otherwise. I had staked it myself, with a bamboo pole and a length of soft tie, on a Saturday afternoon in April when the air still had cold in it and the maple's new leaves were small and pale green and looked provisional. I set my coffee cup down on the counter. I read the listing. $471,000. 2-bedroom, 1-bath, craftsman bungalow, 2 blocks from the Harrow Bay waterfront. The listing had gone live the previous evening, late enough that I would have been asleep, early enough that any early morning buyer scrolling the app would see it as a new listing. The agent of record was Dale Whitfield of Pacific Coast Realty. The open house was scheduled for that same Sunday, 2 to 4 in the afternoon. Approximately 7 hours from the moment I was standing in the kitchen reading his description of my house. The sellers listed were Marcus and Renata Van. My name was not there. I looked at that listing for perhaps 30 seconds. I memorized the MLS number. I read the listing agent's contact information. I noted the name of the escrow holder. Coastal Land Title. Then I picked up my phone and called the title company. What none of them knew, not my mother-in-law Renata, not Dale Whitfield, not my husband Marcus, who was, at that moment, asleep in the bedroom down the hall, was that the deed to that bungalow carried exactly one name on it. Mine. It had carried only my name since the day I closed on the property 26 months before Marcus and I went on our first date, and in the 3 years of our marriage, not one amendment, not one joint title filing, not one interspousal transfer deed had been executed to change that fact. The house was mine in the way that things you research and purchase and maintain and pay for entirely on your own are yours, completely, by the record, without complication. I won't explain how a person arrives at that Sunday morning because none of what happened makes sense without the years before it. I have been a civil structural engineer for 9 years. I started at a regional firm in Portland where I spent 4 years doing load calculations for commercial builds, retail centers, a parking structure, 2 small hospital wings. It is meticulous work that requires a kind of sustained attention that most people find tedious and that I find clarifying. A structural calculation either holds or it doesn't. A load path either resolves correctly or there is a failure point, and your job is to find the failure point before the building does. I am good at finding failure points. My supervisor at the Portland firm used to say I had a quality he called preemptive pessimism, which he meant as a compliment, the habit of assuming the worst case and designing backward from there until the structure is sound regardless. I moved to a mid-size infrastructure consultancy after I received my professional engineering license. That firm had a satellite office opening in Harrow Bay, a small coastal town on the Oregon coast, the kind of place that has one main street, a harbor, a Thursday farmer's market, and the particular quality of light that comes from being between mountains and water. The consultancy was expanding its portfolio of coastal infrastructure work, seawall assessments, pier and dock structural reviews, the occasional historic building rehabilitation. I applied for the Harrow Bay position because I had done a site assessment there on a contract basis and liked both the work and the place. I got the position. I relocated in March 4 years ago now. My supervisor at the Harrow Bay office is Tom Eklund, who is in his early 50s, has been doing coastal infrastructure work for 25 years, and has the calm of a man who has seen enough structural failures to understand that calm is a professional tool. He has a habit of saying, when I flag something others have missed, that I catch the thing on a second pass, which he means as the highest form of occupational praise, and which I have come to understand is simply an accurate description of how I was trained to read documents. In structural engineering, the document is the work. The blueprint, the soil report, the load calculation, the inspection record, these are not supporting materials. They are the primary thing. Get them wrong or fail to read them carefully, and the consequences are physical and often irreversible. I read everything carefully. I have always read everything carefully. When I say this, I mean it in the professional sense, but I also mean it in the personal one. I do not sign documents I have not read. I do not assume that a verbal agreement covers the same ground as a written one. I do not leave important records in ambiguous locations or trust memory to substitute for documentation. These are professional habits, but they are also, as it turned out, the habits that govern the morning of that Sunday in October. I bought the bungalow on Carver Street in the spring of the year I relocated to Harrow Bay. I had been renting a furnished apartment near the office for the first 3 months, long enough to understand the town's geography and the real estate dynamics before I started looking in earnest. I was not in a rush. I had been building a down payment for 7 years by the time I arrived in Harrow Bay, 7 years of the particular discipline of a person who grew up in a household where money was managed carefully because it had to be, who understood from an early age that financial security is not something that arrives but something that is constructed, the same way a sound structure is constructed, load by load, with careful attention to what each element will bear. The bungalow at 114 Carver Street was the 4th property I viewed. I knew it was the right one within 20 minutes of the walkthrough. Not because it was perfect. The kitchen needed updating and one of the upstairs windows had a seal failure that was going to cost money, but because the structure was sound. The foundation had been poured with care. The framing was solid and the load path was clean, and when I stood in the main room and looked at the ceiling and the walls, I could see the work of someone who had understood what they were building. The seller was an older man who had owned the property for 30 years and was relocating to be near his daughter in Idaho. He had maintained the place the way people maintain things they intend to keep a long time and only sell reluctantly. The cedar siding was original and in good condition. The covered porch faced southwest. The backyard backed to a greenway. The purchase price was $298,500. I put down $60,000 and financed the rest through a regional lender whose mortgage officer, a careful and methodical woman named Diane Kerrigan, walked me through every document in the closing package and asked me to initial each page before signing. I initialed each page. The closing was a Tuesday in April in the title company's conference room, with Diane Kerrigan present and a notary and the seller's agent and the pleasant bureaucratic rhythm of a transaction done correctly. The title policy, when I received it, listed one owner of record, Nadia Osei. I read the policy the same evening, cover to cover, because that is what you do with documents that govern something as significant as a property title. Then I made a folder on my laptop labeled with the property address and the closing date, and I photographed the key documents, the purchase contract, the closing disclosure, the title policy, and I transferred those photographs to a USB drive that I labeled with a piece of tape in block letters and put in the top left drawer of what was, by then, my home office desk. I planted the Japanese maple the first Saturday of May. It was a 2-gallon container plant from the nursery on Route 9. The woman there told me to stake it for 2 growing seasons minimum against the coast wind. I bought the bamboo stakes and the soft ties. I set the maple in the ground in the southwest corner of the front yard, where it would get the afternoon light, and I staked it with 2 poles crossed at the base, the way the nursery woman showed me. That was 3 years before Marcus and I went on our first date. I met Marcus Van at a professional association mixer in the spring of my 2nd year in Harrow Bay. He was in commercial lending, business development for a regional bank that financed construction and infrastructure projects, which meant our professional paths had overlapped in the way that the paths of people who work adjacent to the same industry occasionally do. He was 35 at the time, easy in rooms in the particular way of people who have been socially comfortable their whole lives, and he laughed when I described the failure mode of a specific type of anchor bolt connection in a way that told me he had actually followed what I said. We dated for 14 months. He was direct in a way I respected and patient in a way that worked well with the demands of my schedule. He could be quiet without filling the silence with obligation. He was not the kind of man who required managing. We understood each other's professional rhythms, and we shared a quality that I had come to value in people, which is the capacity to disagree without making the disagreement about something other than the disagreement. I liked Marcus. I want to be precise about that and honest about it, because this story is not about Marcus in the way it is about what happened around him. He was not its author. He was, at most, a person who failed to read a document carefully enough and then failed to mention the oversight to me. We were engaged for 8 months. We married on a Saturday in October at a vineyard 40 minutes inland. 22 guests, no DJ. A dinner that ran late because the speeches went longer than planned and nobody stopped them. We moved into the bungalow together after the wedding. Marcus had been renting an apartment near his office. He gave it up and moved his things into the Carver Street house, into the rooms that were by then fully mine, my furniture, my books, my engineering reference library on the shelves in the study, my coffee maker on the kitchen counter that I had owned since Portland, and that had moved with me twice already. We talked, once, in the months after the wedding, about adding Marcus to the deed. It was a brief and inconclusive conversation. I said I would look into the process. Marcus said there was no rush. The conversation did not come up again. We both moved on to more immediate matters, a repair on the bungalow's roof, a conference Tom had sent me to in Seattle, Marcus's quarterly review at work, and the deed question settled into the category of things that would get addressed eventually. Eventually had not arrived by the Sunday morning I found the listing. This is a fact I have turned over many times since. In the chain of paperwork and process that allowed my mother-in-law to list my house for sale, the absence of Marcus's name from the deed was the load-bearing error. If the deed had been amended, if we had filed the interspousal transfer when I said I would look into it, then Renata's assumption would have had some legal grounding, however partial. The listing would still have required my consent, but the title question would have been different. Instead, the deed was exactly as it had been on the Tuesday in April when I signed the closing documents alone, and no subsequent filing had changed it, and when Janet Morse at Coastal Land Title pulled the county assessor's record on a Sunday morning in October, there was only one name there.
Mine.
The sequence of events, as I eventually reconstructed it from conversations with Marcus and from Priya Sundaram's inquiry to Dale Whitfield, was this. In the 6 weeks before I found the listing, Renata had arrived at the conclusion that the bungalow on Carver Street was too small for the trajectory she had in mind for Marcus and me, and that the coastal market was in a favorable position for sellers, and that the appropriate next step was a larger property more suited to what she considered proper family accommodation. She had a particular house in mind. She mentioned it later. A newer construction on the east side of town with a formal dining room and a 3-car garage, and she had been thinking about the Carver Street property as the instrument that would finance it. When I asked Marcus what he understood his role in this plan to have been, he said that his mother had mentioned once, over a Sunday dinner at his parents' house while I was on a weekend site consultation, that properties like the bungalow were selling above asking and that it might be worth considering a move. He said he had responded with something non-committal. He thought he had said the market was interesting, and that he had not understood this exchange to constitute an endorsement of a sale, a listing, or the engagement of a real estate agent. Renata had understood it differently. In the 5 weeks before I found the listing, Renata had contacted Dale Whitfield, whom she had met through a neighbor who had used his firm the previous year. She had explained to Dale that the property was her son and daughter-in-law's home, and that they were considering selling. She had arranged for Dale to tour the property on a Thursday morning while I was at work and while Marcus, working from home, had let him in under the understanding that it was an exploratory walkthrough with no commitment implied. Dale Whitfield had done the walkthrough. He had provided a comparative market analysis with a recommended listing price of $471,000, which Renata had approved in a follow-up call. He had then asked, as part of his listing preparation, about the ownership documentation. Renata had told him that the property was jointly owned by her son and daughter-in-law, and that the documentation was in order. Dale Whitfield had listed the property on the MLS that Saturday evening. I have had occasion in my professional life to review the standard of care expected of listing agents in real estate transactions. Independent title verification before listing is not a universal legal requirement in the same way it is in other stages of the transaction. The title search happens formally at the escrow stage, not the listing stage. But it is a widely observed professional practice, and it is the practice that would have surfaced the ownership discrepancy immediately. Dale Whitfield did not conduct one. He accepted Renata Van's representation of the title situation at face value and listed the property. I want to be precise about why this matters beyond the immediate situation. The county assessor's property records are publicly searchable. They have been for years. A query on the address would have returned one name, and that name was mine, and that information was available on the day Renata called Dale Whitfield's office, and on every day between that call and the Saturday the listing went live. The verification that would have prevented all of what followed was 5 minutes of work that no one performed. In my profession, the load calculation that is not checked is the one that fails. The inspection record that is not filed is the one you need when the structure is disputed. The document that is not verified is the one that creates the problem. I have spent 9 years building the habit of checking before I assume. Dale Whitfield had the tool in front of him and did not use it. The open house signs went up on Saturday afternoon. My neighbor Carol, a retired teacher who has lived across from the bungalow for 11 years and who notices things the way people who have been in one place long enough notice things, thoroughly without effort, saw the signs go up and recognized the address. She sent me a text at 4:47 Saturday afternoon that said, "Nadia, are you moving? There's an open house sign in front of your place." I did not see the text until the next morning because I had been on a work call that ran late and then had dinner with a colleague and gone to bed early. I saw Carol's text at approximately the same moment I found the listing, and I understood, for the first time, why she had asked. I did not go to the job site that morning. I called Tom Eklund at 7:22 and asked him to send my junior engineer, a capable second year named Brandon Chu, to cover the site visit. I gave Tom the inspection scope in 2 minutes over the phone. He asked whether there was a problem. I told him I had a property matter that required my attention that day. He said understood and handled it without further questions, which is one of the qualities I have valued in Tom Eklund across 4 years of working for him. He manages by information rather than by presence, and he trusts his engineers to know when they need coverage. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open and the listing on the screen and the MLS number written on the notepad I keep beside the coffee maker. Marcus was still asleep. The house was quiet. Through the kitchen window, I could see the Japanese maple, now in its 3rd full season, the canopy wide and well-established, the leaves beginning to turn at the edges the way they do in October, when the light shifts. The maple did not need the stake anymore. It had not needed it since the end of its 2nd season. The title company number was listed in the escrow details of the MLS record. Coastal Land Title. I called at 7:31 and expected voicemail. Instead, a woman answered on the 3rd ring. She gave her name as Janet Morse, title officer, and said she was catching up on weekend paperwork. I told her I was calling about an active listing at 114 Carver Street in Harrow Bay and that I had a question about the ownership documentation on the property. She asked my name. I gave it. Nadia Osei. She asked me to spell the last name. I spelled it. I heard keyboard sounds. A pause that stretched. "Ms. Osei," she said, "I'm pulling the county assessor's record and the title chain for this property." Her voice had changed from the brisk, professional tone of someone answering a routine Sunday call. It had become careful, the specific care of someone who has found something in a document that requires handling. "Are you the purchaser of record from?" She checked the date. "April. 3 years ago?" I confirmed I was. "And has there been any subsequent transfer, amendment, or interspousal deed executed on this property since the original purchase date?" I said there had not. 7 seconds of silence. I know it was 7 seconds because I counted them. It is a habit from load calculation review. When the numbers are not resolving, you count the seconds before you speak, because speaking too early closes down the thinking. I counted 7, and Janet Morse spoke on the 8th. "Ms. Osei," she said, According to the records in front of me, you are the sole owner of record on this deed. Your name is the only name on the title. This property has not been jointly held at any point in the title chain. I said I was aware of that. The current listing identifies the sellers as Marcus and Renata Van, she said. Neither of those names appear in the ownership record. I said I was aware of that as well. A pause. I heard her draw a breath, not dramatically, just the breath of a professional recalibrating the scope of what she is dealing with. I'm going to place a hold on this transaction and flag it for our title officer supervisor, she said. We cannot proceed to escrow without clear title. I'll need to notify the listing agent. I said I thought that was the appropriate course of action. Do you have legal representation? She asked. I told her I was in the process of retaining an attorney. She gave me her direct number. I wrote it in my notepad beside the MLS number. I thanked her and ended the call. The kitchen was quiet. The maple moved in the morning wind. I watched it for a moment, not for any particular reason, just because it was there, and it was familiar, and it had been there for 3 years, in the ground I had prepared and staked and tended, and it was still there. Then I went to the home office, opened the top left desk drawer, and took out the USB drive. I called Priya Sundram at 9 o'clock that morning. Priya was a real estate attorney whose card I had kept from a commercial project 2 years earlier, where she had handled a title dispute on an adjacent parcel. She had impressed me then with the economy of her work. She asked the exact questions she needed to ask, and none of the ones she didn't. She moved at the speed of someone who respects that other people's time is finite, and she had resolved the dispute cleanly and without the kind of procedural noise that sometimes substitutes for actual problem-solving in legal matters. I had kept her card in the same desk drawer as the USB drive. She answered her cell on the second ring. I explained the situation in 4 minutes, using the same sequential structure I use for structural reports. What happened, in what order, what the current state is, what I need. She asked 3 questions: the purchase date, whether any deed amendment had been filed, and whether I had the title policy. I answered all 3. She said, "Send me the title policy and the closing disclosure from the USB drive. I'll have a letter to the listing agent and the title company by end of today." I photographed the documents on the USB drive and sent them to her email before 10 o'clock. By 11:40, Priya Sundram had transmitted formal correspondence to Dale Whitfield at Pacific Coast Realty and to Janet Morse at Coastal Land Title, stating the following in plain, precise terms. The property at 114 Carver Street, Harrow Bay, was the sole and exclusive property of Nadia Osei, as established by the title record and confirmed by the title policy in the name of the owner of record. No authorization for listing, marketing, or sale of the property had been given by the owner of record. The listing should be withdrawn immediately, and all transaction documents and communications related to the property should be preserved pending further instruction from Ms. Osei's legal representative. The open house was still 2 hours away. At 12:51, Dale Whitfield called me directly. He had the measured voice of a professional who has received news that requires him to reassess his recent decisions, but who understands that the appropriate response is management rather than reaction. He confirmed that he had received Priya Sundram's letter. He said he was withdrawing the listing effective immediately. He said he regretted that he had not independently verified the title documentation prior to listing, and that he had been given a representation of ownership that he now understood to have been inaccurate. He said he hoped I would understand that his firm's standard practice included a title search at the escrow stage, and that this situation had not proceeded to that stage. I said I understood. I said I appreciated the prompt response. He thanked me for being direct. His voice had a quality that I recognized from construction site conversations when a subcontractor has made an error and knows it and is not compounding it with deflection, the particular professionalism of someone taking responsibility at the appropriate scale. The open house signs were taken down that afternoon. My neighbor Carol texted me at 2:17, the hour the open house would have started, and said, "Looks like it's not happening. You okay?" I texted back that everything was fine and that I would explain later. She sent back a single thumbs up, which was exactly the right response. Marcus came home at 1:15. He had gone to his parents' house that morning, a Sunday routine, coffee with his mother, and had been there when Dale Whitfield called Renata to inform her that the listing was being withdrawn due to a title complication. He had then been there when Renata called Priya Sundaram's office number and reached a voicemail that confirmed Priya's role as counsel to Nadia Ose regarding the property at 114 Carver Street. He had been there for the hour that followed, which he later described in careful, limited terms that I understood to mean it had not been a comfortable morning. He came through the front door with his keys in his hand and stopped in the entrance to the kitchen where I was sitting. He looked at the laptop open on the table, at the notepad with the MLS number still written on it, at the USB drive sitting beside the mouse. "Nadia," he said. I looked at him. He sat down across from me, without being invited to. He put his keys on the table. "My mother," he started again. "She thought because we're married that it was both of ours. She genuinely believed that." "I understand that," I said. "She wasn't trying to. She thought she was doing something useful." He said this carefully, with the tone of a man who has been thinking about how to say it and has chosen the most accurate version. "I know that doesn't change it." "No," I said. "It doesn't." He looked at the USB drive on the table. "The deed is only in your name. It always has been." His hands, flat on the table, did not move. "When we talked about adding me, I said I would look into it," I said. "I didn't. That's not what changed the situation, though. Even with a joint deed, she would have needed my consent." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "I should have told you about the conversation she mentioned. The one about selling." "Yes." "I didn't think it was going anywhere," he said. "I thought it was, her thinking out loud." I looked at him steadily. He met my eyes without looking away, which I noted. "Your mother doesn't think out loud," I said. "She plans out loud. There's a difference." His expression shifted in a way I recognized, the expression of a man acknowledging something he has known for some time but has been managing around. His chin moved slightly. He looked at the table and then back at me. "What do you need from me?" he said. I told him. A conversation with his mother, one that established, clearly and without revision, what was mine and what decisions pertaining to it required my knowledge and consent. Not punitive. Not an ultimatum. Simply accurate and documented going forward. I also told him that Priya Sundaram was my attorney of record on this matter and that any future questions about the property should come to me. He nodded through all of it. When I finished, he said, "I'll talk to her." Not to explain. To be clear. I said that was what I was asking for. The meeting with Renata happened 4 days later, on a Thursday evening, at her house. Priya Sundaram's advice had been to hold the meeting on neutral to Renata territory to reduce defensiveness and increase the likelihood of a productive outcome. I agreed with the logic. I had applied a similar principle in client meetings on contentious infrastructure projects. The location of a conversation shapes its emotional register before anyone speaks, and a productive outcome is worth a strategic concession on venue. Marcus and I arrived at 6:30. Renata opened the door in the particular way she had of opening doors, fully, a broad gesture, as if the opening were an act of welcome that announced itself. She had arranged her expression in advance. I recognized the arrangement. Composed, receiving, prepared to be misunderstood, and ready with a response to that misunderstanding. Her husband Frank was in the living room with the television on at a low volume. He looked at me when I came in and nodded, and then he looked at the television and remained there. I registered that he had made a choice and did not comment on it. Renata brought us to the dining table. She had tea prepared, which she offered, and which Marcus accepted. I said no thank you. She sat across from us. She had her hands on the table in front of her, not folded exactly but close, the hands of a woman who is organized and who organizes with her hands as well as her words. She looked at me with the expression she had prepared, and she spoke first, which I expected. She said she had been trying to do something useful for the family. She said Marcus had mentioned that the market was doing well. She glanced at Marcus when she said this, a brief and purposeful glance that I understood to be an invitation for him to affirm the account, and that she had simply been trying to move things forward while conditions were favorable. She said she had believed the house was jointly held, as it would be in any normal marriage, and that she had meant no harm by proceeding on that understanding. She said the word misunderstanding twice in the first 90 seconds, and both times she used it as a noun rather than a verb, which meant she was framing a description rather than accepting a responsibility. I let her finish. I had learned, in client meetings where the other party has a prepared position, that the worst time to introduce new information is while they are still delivering the prepared position. You wait. You let the position land. Then you introduce the information into the silence that follows. I had the title policy on the table. I had printed it that morning, one page, the key section on top. When Renata finished, I placed my index finger on the owner of record line and I said, "This is my name. It is the only name on this title. It has been the only name on this title since the April I purchased the property, which was before Marcus and I were together." Renata looked at the document. She looked at the line with my name on it for a duration that was longer than a casual reading, long enough that I could see her reading it more than once, the way you read a number that does not match your expectation and return to it before you accept that it says what it says. Then she looked up at me. Her expression had shifted from the composed, receiving arrangement to something quieter and more internal. "I didn't know that," she said. "Now you do," I said. There was a pause. Marcus, beside me, had not spoken. He was looking at the document on the table with the specific quality of attention of a man who is completing a calculation he has been working on for several days. Renata said, "I was trying to help the family move forward." I said, "I understand that. And I understand that you believed you were acting on information that supported it." I kept my voice level, and I kept it without edge because what I was saying was true. I did understand, and the understanding was not the same thing as agreement. What I need you to understand is that the record is clear. This house is mine. Any decision about it, to sell, to renovate, to stay, to leave, comes from me. Not from a family discussion I'm not part of. Not from a conversation where someone says that's interesting and that gets treated as authorization. From me, directly, in writing if the decision warrants it. I paused. I wanted the next thing I said to land in its own space. "That is not a conflict," I said. "That is not me being difficult. It is simply accurate. Going forward, if there are questions about the property, you ask me." Frank cleared his throat from the living room. The sound was neutral. None of us responded to it. Renata looked at the title policy again. Her hands, which had been close to folded on the table, tightened slightly, a brief contraction, knuckles going pale, and then settling. She was a woman who had been managing things for 4 decades, and she had just encountered a situation she had not managed correctly, and she was in the process of absorbing the full scope of that without the ability to revise it. I recognized the process because I had seen it professionally. The moment when a project supervisor realizes the load path was calculated on a wrong assumption, and the entire structure has to be reconsidered from the actual conditions, not the assumed ones. The structure does not care what you believed. It responds to what is true. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'll speak to Dale about this." I said, "Dale has a complete written account from my attorney. He has what he needs." She nodded. A single, deliberate movement. Her knuckles were still pale. She looked at the document one more time and then looked at me with an expression that was not hostile and was not warm and was, I thought, as close to accurate as she was able to get in that room on that evening. The expression of a woman who has understood, for the first time and fully, that the map she had been navigating by was not the territory. We stayed another 25 minutes. The conversation moved to other things. A trip Marcus's parents were planning, a change at Frank's work, something about a cousin's new apartment, and it was civil and careful in the register of conversations that have passed through something substantial and are returning to the surface. I participated in those 25 minutes the same way I had come into the house, without hostility, without performance, without the need to make the evening into something other than what it was. When Marcus and I left, I shook Renata's hand at the door. She accepted it with the stillness of a woman who is recalibrating and who is doing so without an audience if she can manage it. She managed it. The weeks after the meeting had their own particular texture. Dale Whitfield sent a formal letter of apology. It was professionally composed, covering the necessary acknowledgments without admitting specific liability, which Priya Sundaram said was standard in these situations, and which I accepted without expectation of more. I added the letter to the laptop folder and to the USB drive. Priya Sundaram's invoice I paid promptly, and also added to the folder. I keep complete records of matters that have had legal dimensions, the same way I keep complete inspection records on buildings I have reviewed. Not because I expect to need them, but because the day you need a record and don't have it is the day you understand why records are kept. The social dimension of the situation was less clean but not surprising. Renata had told two of Marcus's cousins and at least one of her close friends that the Carver Street bungalow was being sold. One of the cousins, a man named Drew who worked at Marcus's bank, had mentioned the sale to a colleague of Marcus's, a piece of information Marcus received the following week in the form of a colleague asking whether they had found somewhere new to live. Marcus handled it briefly and correctly. He said there had been a misunderstanding about the ownership of the property, and the sale was not happening. His colleague, whom Marcus described as professionally tactful, asked no follow-up questions. Marcus told me about it that evening. We were at the kitchen table, the same table where we had talked the Sunday afternoon. He came home. He relayed the conversation neutrally and without editorializing, which I appreciated. "How did you explain it?" I asked. "Exactly like that," he said. "Misunderstanding about ownership. Sale isn't happening." Did he ask more? No. I said that was the right answer. Marcus said, "I talked to my mother again. The day after the meeting." He paused. A longer conversation. I waited. "She cried," he said. He said it simply, with the particular flatness of a person reporting something he had steeled himself for and gotten through. I don't say that too. I'm not asking you to accommodate it. I'm just telling you what happened. I said I appreciated him telling me. "I told her what the pattern is," he said. "Not this specifically. The pattern. The way she makes decisions for the unit and then presents them as though the consultation already happened." He looked at the table. "She said she didn't know she did it." Do you believe her? He thought about it, which I respected. "I believe she doesn't experience it that way," he said. "I believe she understands now that it exists as a pattern, even if she doesn't feel it as one." I said that was an accurate distinction. He nodded. "It won't disappear," he said, "but I'll catch it now, when it's pointed at you." I said that was what I needed. The weeks after the meeting had their own particular texture, and I want to describe them carefully, because they were not a clean resolution. They were the beginning of one. Dale Whitfield sent a formal letter of apology 7 days after the listing was withdrawn. It was professionally composed, thorough enough to be meaningful, careful enough not to constitute an admission of specific liability, which Priya Syndrome said was standard and which I accepted without requiring more. He noted that his firm was implementing an independent title verification step before any listing agreement was executed going forward. He said this with the tone of a professional who has made an error and is correcting the practice rather than defending it. I respected the letter for what it was. I added it to the folder on my laptop. I transferred it to the USB drive. Priya Syndrome's invoice, $1,800 for the Sunday call, the formal correspondence to the listing agent and title company, and a follow-up letter to an inquiry sent on Renata's behalf by her personal attorney. I paid promptly and filed the receipt in the same folder. I keep complete records of matters that have had legal dimensions, the way I maintain complete documentation on every building I have inspected, not because I expect the records to be needed again, but because the assumption that they won't be is the assumption that produces problems. The social dimension was less clean. Renata had told at least 5 people the house was being sold. 2 of Marcus's cousins, a close friend of hers named Patrice, a woman from her book club, and a neighbor down the street who had expressed interest in buying the property herself. Each of these people had to receive some version of an explanation for why the sale was not happening. The explanations Renata gave, which I heard about secondhand, through Marcus and through Carol, varied in detail but converged on a single frame. There had been a complication with the paperwork. Complication with the paperwork. I turned that phrase over in my mind for several days. It was technically accurate. It was also a sentence that could mean almost anything, and that contained no information about who held the title, who had not been consulted, or why the listing had been live for less than 48 hours before being withdrawn. I did not correct Renata's framing publicly. I understood that she was managing her own social reality, and that managing it was going to require some version of a story, and that the story she told was, in the relevant ways, less important than the document that remained unchanged in the county records. The cousin Drew's situation required the most direct management. He worked at Marcus's bank, and he had mentioned the pending sale to a colleague of Marcus's at a work lunch. Marcus arrived at the office the following Monday to a colleague asking whether they had already found somewhere new. Marcus handled it with the economy of someone who has decided the simplest version is the most durable one. Misunderstanding about the ownership of the property. Sale is not happening. His colleague, professionally tactful, did not push further. Marcus told me about it at the kitchen table that evening, relaying it without editorializing. "How did you explain it?" I asked. "Exactly like that," he said. "Misunderstanding about ownership. Sale isn't happening." Did he ask anything else?
No.
I said that was the right answer. The months that followed settled into something different from what we had before. Not a restoration exactly, but a recalibration. Renata, in my presence, stopped referring to the bungalow as Marcus's house. I noticed the first time she didn't say it. We were at a family dinner in November. A conversation came up about the neighborhood, and she said Nadia's place with a slightly deliberate quality of someone using a phrase they have consciously selected. I did not acknowledge it outwardly. I filed it in the category of things moving in the right direction, which is a different category from things that are fixed. She began directing property questions to me rather than through Marcus. It was an imperfect shift. She occasionally defaulted to the old routing and Marcus redirected her, which he did without drama and without requiring acknowledgement, but it was consistent, and over time it became less effortful. A structural adjustment becomes less effortful once it has been load-tested enough times to hold. Carol, across the street, had the broad shape of the story. I had given it to her the way you give a trusted neighbor information, enough to account for what she had observed, not enough to burden her with what didn't concern her. She is a practical woman who has been on this block for 11 years and who, by that tenure alone, has earned a certain kind of understanding. She said, when I explained it, "Good thing you had the paperwork in order." I said it was. She said, "I saw the look on that agent's face when he came to take down the sign." I asked what the look was. She said, "Like a man doing arithmetic, he wishes he had done 3 weeks earlier." I said that was accurate. Tom Eklund knew none of the specifics. He knew I had taken a personal day, that Brandon had covered the site visit competently, and that the matter had been resolved. He asked once, about a month later, whether everything was sorted. I said it was. He said good, and we went back to the seawall assessment we had been discussing. That was the entirety of it. Marcus and I had several conversations during those months that we had been postponing without naming the postponement. Some of them were hard. All of them were necessary. We addressed things that had been filed under eventually for too long, and that the Sunday morning had moved out of that category permanently. We are still married. I state that as a fact, not a declaration, because it is part of the story and a complete account requires it. 18 months after the Sunday morning I found my house on the listing app, I received an offer from a larger infrastructure firm headquartered in Seattle, senior project lead, a significant step up, a salary increase that warranted serious consideration. Tom Eklund mentioned the opportunity and said the decision was entirely mine, which is the kind of managerial phrasing that means precisely what it says, and no more. I thought about it for 2 weeks. I built a table. I do this with significant decisions, the same way I build load calculations, with every variable listed and its weight assigned and the result derived from the actual numbers rather than from the version of the numbers that makes one answer easier. I assess the professional upside. I assessed the relocation cost, the timeline, what the move would mean for Marcus's work, what it would mean for Tom's office. I assessed what it would mean to leave the bungalow on Carver Street. That last variable is the one I want to be precise about because it was not sentimental in the way people might assume. I am not a person who has difficulty leaving places. I relocated to Harrow Bay without significant hesitation because the work was good and the town was right and the calculation favored it. This was different. What I was assessing was not attachment to Cedar siding or to a particular morning light. I was assessing what it would mean to leave a thing that had been contested and was now settled, and whether leaving it would mean something about the contestation. I decided it would not, but I also decided that I did not want to leave. Those are 2 different conclusions, and both of them were mine. I turned down the offer. I told Tom it was the roots. He understood immediately. in the way of someone who has been in Harrow Bay long enough to have his own roots there, and he laughed the short, genuine laugh of someone who finds unexpected precision satisfying. He said it was the best reason he had heard for turning down a senior position, and that he was glad I was staying. I said I was glad too. I still do the morning listing check while my coffee finishes. The habit has not changed, but what it contains has. There is a specific quality to the moment when a property thumbnail loads, and I recognize the angle, the particular pitch of a roofline, the shape of a covered porch, the corner of a yard I know, and I look at the address and confirm it is not mine. That moment used to be just data. Now it carries a small additional weight, the weight of having learned, on a specific Sunday morning, what it means to already have the document you need in the place you know to find it. The maple in the front yard is 5 years old now. The canopy is wide enough that it throws genuine shade across the full width of the porch steps on a summer afternoon. The cedar siding has weathered the way cedar siding on the Oregon coast weathers when it is maintained, with character and without deterioration. The study is still my office. The USB drive is still in the top left desk drawer. I have added 2 documents to it since that October: Dale Whitfield's letter of apology and Priya Sundaram's formal correspondence. I have also backed the entire drive to cloud storage, because a single point of failure is not a sound documentation strategy, and I am an engineer, and I know better than to keep only one copy of the thing I cannot afford to lose. There is a particular kind of erasure that does not announce itself. It moves quietly, through assumptions and unchecked representations and conversations held without you, and it relies on you not having the paperwork in order. The answer is not to be louder. The answer is to have the document, to know where it is, and to hand it to the right person at the right moment, and let the record do the work you have already done by keeping it. An engineer does not assume that a structure that was sound yesterday is sound today. She checks. She documents. She files. She backs it up. Not because she expects a problem, but because the expectation that there will be no problem is not the same as preparation for the possibility that there will be. I keep the USB drive in the top left drawer, because that is where I put the things I cannot afford to lose. Janet Morse went silent for 7 seconds when she found my name alone on that title record. I have thought about those 7 seconds many times since. She was a title officer doing weekend paperwork on a Sunday morning, and she pulled a county record and found exactly one name where a listing had implied 2, and she understood immediately what that meant for the transaction she was about to process. I think she had seen something like this before. I think she knew before she spoke the shape of what she was going to have to say and to whom and what it would change. I think those 7 seconds were the time it took her to choose the right words for a situation that required precision. And I find myself wondering, have you ever been in that kind of silence? Either side of it. The side where you're waiting for someone to finish what they've found, or the side where you're the one who has to tell someone what the record actually says. What is it like to be in that moment before the words come? If you have been there, I would like to hear about it in the comments. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this one. A new story posts every Thursday. I will see you there.